Hi, I'm Wayne Tuttle, and this is Chasing Legends. Welcome back to Chasing Legends. I'm Wayne Tuttle, your host once again. Please hit subscribe, hit the notification bell, leave a comment, check out our website, legendsofsuperstitionmountains.com. We're going to get right into it today. Now, this is something I've talked about. I referenced quite a bit on live just this last week on our Friday Live Legends. I referenced it. It's a book. It's called Arizona Cowboys. It's by a gentleman by the name of Dane Coolidge. Dane Coolidge wrote this book around the mid to late 1930s. He was a Western author, wrote fiction and nonfiction. Later in life, he wrote a lot of nonfiction, including this book about his travels in the Southwest in Arizona. He wrote this book about a lot of his travels in the Southwest in Arizona, New Mexico, Mexico. In this particular book, he wrote while working, being around a number of ranchers in the Four Peaks area, around the Salt River, north of the Superstitions. I kind of picked it up because I saw that there was several photographs and some mention of Pancho Monroy, and kind of got the book, thought it was interesting. It was during the period of 1903, 1904. Imagine my surprise, I'm reading in a chapter and I see him mention the Lost Dutchman Mine, and I goes, oh, a couple little things like someone had asked someone about it, and the cowboy mentions a couple things, and I was like, oh, that was interesting, and it was in reference to the Jacob Waltz having a nephew, and he calls him Jerry, but he says, yes, he killed Jerry, and all this stuff, and then he said, we know he was buried by hidden water, and my cousin here, Gomez, is the one who found him and brought the skull back and all. And that was an odd kind of out of reference. But then the next chapter surprised me more because it was called The Lost Dutchman Mine. In that, Jacob Waltz now becomes Jacob Miller. His nephew is Jerry Miller. They're kind of all running around, and they're down in Mexico, and they run into some Mexicans getting ready to go on an expedition up into Arizona. And when they go to do this, the Millers kind of inquire, hey, you heading up in Arizona? We're getting ready to head back that way. We accompany you and help you out with the Apaches. The Mexicans decide to take them on with them for added protection and security. They go up. There's a mine. They become partners, 50-50, cleaning out this mine. They return to Mexico, and Jacob and Jerry Miller, it still cracks me up. But the Mexicans go off and gamble. The Millers are just hanging around town, doing their thing, eating, relaxing before they head back out to Arizona or continue on their way. And the Mexicans say, we are going to have to return. We've lost all our money. And the Millers say, well, we have almost 60,000 from that trip. How about we make you a deal? Rather than you have to go back, why don't you give us the title of your deed to the mine, and we'll go back and get what we want, because that's where we're going to be anyways, and you'll do this. So they make the swap with the additional caveat that you give us some pack animals and stuff to take. So that agreement's made. The Millers go back up. They go up to the mountains. They go to get the gold. They get the gold. They know the Apaches are lurking about, so they're trying to be very cautious. And then Jerry decides to protect their interests on the mine, because there's plenty of gold they're going to have to return a number of times. He's going to go to Santa Fe in New Mexico and file a claim on this. And Jacob Miller says, no, you're not. And Jerry says, you're not going to stop me. I'm just going to get it done. Jacob's thought process is, if you do this, it's going to alert people that there is a mine out here. We're going to have problems with claims jumpers and people being out here when we're not here. Nobody's going to find this place otherwise. Jerry says, no, I'm going to go file the claim. He leaves camp, and as he's leaving camp, Jacob follows him up, shoots him, and then buries him at hidden water. Jacob continues to get the gold and make trips. He deposits his gold at the Valley National Bank. Unique little part of the story. He settles in town, and he buys a home, and he's pretty well off, obviously, going to return gold, but he needs someone to watch his place and kind of look after things like a butler. So he hires a man and kind of partners with a man named Rodriguez. And he hires a black woman to be his housekeeper and cook. It's different. So anyways, Rodriguez keeps Waltz from getting in trouble or people from like trying to steal from him and so forth. The problem is Rodriguez starts out as a pretty nice guy, but he has a drinking problem and he starts to go downhill. And Jacob Waltz Miller decides, I'm having some problems, so he goes and talks to another individual he knows, known as Dick Holmes. He tells Dick Holmes the problem, says, I'm going to tell you where the mine is and stuff, but if Rodriguez finds out, he'll kill both of us. He's just becoming unhinged. So he tells Holmes everything. He says there's a map, but I can't get you the map because Rodriguez has the map. And eventually Waltz draws out kind of the map and shows Holmes where everything is. Holmes is scared to death of Rodriguez and doesn't want to do a thing because of this. Well, Waltz passes away, and Rodriguez afterwards decides he's going to go out and get the gold. So he gets a group of people together, and they go out to this mine, and they go to grab the gold. And the Apaches attack them. Not just Apaches, Mojave Apaches. And they attack and kill everybody, including Rodriguez. Well, because they never return, this scares Holmes even more. And they talk how Dick Holmes is afraid of the mountains, and Dick Holmes will never step foot in there. So even though he has the map and knows where the mine is, he's a coward, so that's the end of that story. They say the Indians, the Apache, did not know where or what was going on with the mine. And so they return after it was either a train robbery or a stagecoach or a freight robbery. They went back to look at the spot where these guys had been, where they'd killed them, because they figured they'd stashed their stuff in this mine shaft. And when they went back, they realized it was full of gold, but they didn't know what to do with the gold. They couldn't file a claim on it, and they weren't sure, so they dumped a bunch of big boulders in it and covered it over. The Apache knew where it was. The individual telling the story said he knew an old Indian that actually might talk, but he's in prison and nobody can get to talk to him. There was an old squaw who once tried to tell someone, but she was murdered and her husband shut up and he won't talk. So this is the story of the Lost Dutchman. Now we have a lot of problems because Julia Thomas actually owned a business and a house. She wasn't Waltz's housekeeper. Reinhard Petrash completely disappears unless he's Rodriguez at this point. The Dick Holmes thing, I think Dick Holmes wasn't terrified. Well, he was not terrified of the fictitious character Rodriguez. But it shows you also that in 1903 or 1904, this is the story, just slightly 10 years after Waltz had died, that circulates. This is a cowboy out in the Four Peaks area talking around a campfire about the Lost Dutchman Mine. And this is a rather detailed story. So there's a lot of pieces to this. So that's pretty extensive what he has. For me, having read the story and shared it and talked about it, it's one of the problems with the Holmes story is Dick Holmes in newspaper articles told 3 or 4 different variations. Brownie always had his different version. Ida Holmes said she was with Dick Holmes and has a different variation. And this seems to be the one that got in around town. Now, they said Dick Holmes was very quiet and kept to himself, but if 1903, 1904, this is known that well, that Dick Holmes has the information from Waltz and a map, and this whole thing, it's obviously the story was talked about. It was water cooler talk, and Dick Holmes had been talking a lot about this, which he continued to do in the newspapers till he passed away, and then Brownie carried on with a couple exceptions of Ida Holmes telling her story. And the fact that none of the stories really match up, they're all so varied and different, They seem to be pulling from just various sources. Always says a lot to me about the Dick Holmes story. Now, that could be our story for today, but that's not kind of what this is about. This is really, to some degree, about Arizona cowboys, but it's not about Dane Coolidge. The individual that tells the Lost Dutchman story is an individual named Johnny Jones. And he's also known as Juan Jones. And I was didn't think much of it. But then I decided, well, I want to look because this is the guy telling this full-blown story. And he seems a bit articulate to have told it. And it had to be pretty memorable, even with notes, that Dane Coolidge would tell it in its entirety, given an entire chapter. And so I went looking, and I was having trouble. I was like, man, I don't know. This guy. It's a pretty kind of hard name to look up, right? John Jones, Johnny Jones. And then I found Dr. Wilson Walker Jones. He was a medical doctor. He'd come to Arizona from Virginia. He actually did very, very well in life. At one time, I think it was 1876, he sold the Vulture Mine for around $200,000. He operated, besides horses and cattle, he also operated a tuberculosis sanitarium privately, where he cared for people. Rather than the people returned back east, he helped set them up on small ranches and so forth so they could continue to breathe the clean air of Arizona and live longer. Sounded like a really good guy. He married a Mexican woman from Mexico. Imagine that. And he had 6 daughters and 1 son. And his son's name was John Floyd Jones. John Floyd Jones was pretty well educated, could read and write and everything else. But when he was a young teenager, his father passed away. Now, W.W. Jones, the father, set his probate up so his 6 daughters and wife were cared for. Each of them got a stallion, 30 mares, and one of the brands. So one of his brands from his cattle, his various groups of cattle, they would get a particular brand and that cattle was theirs. So they were all pretty well off. He determined that young Johnny, much like him, should go out and about in the world and find his own way and make his own way. And so Johnny was left without anything. It's kind of surprising, but Johnny took this on as his father had passed away. His mother and sisters needed help with all the cattle, the horses and stuff. So he went to work for them, managing the horses, the cattle, the ranches, and the work. At one point in the book, even, it mentions he worked for Jim Bark and learned from Jim Bark. So Johnny Jones actually sounds like a pretty good guy and a hard worker. He was considered a big man, robust, good size, tall. Don't know much else, but he died by the time he was 39, so he probably just worked himself to death. He did manage to go out on his own and raise his own cattle and horses, and his sisters and his mom, for him working so hard to work their herds, they kind of basically did good by him later. So he took care of his family, and they in return tried to take care of him and help set him up, and then he ended up setting up his own ranch. When he passed away, he was his occupation was listed as stockman. It shows that he possibly married a woman named Delia, but it's hard to say because while it says the name Johnny Jones or John Jones could be confused with other people, several reports also say he never married. He was single and had no children. So, but that's the story of John Flynn Jones. Born, I think, 1881 in Tempe, and then died, I'm going to look down here for a second, in 1920. So he died in Tempe in 1920, so his entire life was in Arizona. He was a cattleman, and he would have heard the stories and rode the range and worked for Jim Bark at some time, so he would have been very familiar with the Lost Dutchman story, if anybody would have been, because that's who he would have worked with as a young man as he was working his way up. So that's the story, not only from Dane Coolidge's book on the Lost Dutchman Mine, which I find fascinating because it's so different than anything else we hear, But it's also remarkable because this individual worked with Jim Bark, and you know a lot of information had to be imparted to him from not only Bark, but the cowboys and cowhands around from that time period. So he had to be a bit well versed, but it's almost like a folk story that has almost no bearing on the truth. But I share it a lot because I think it also makes the point of, one, how far these stories can deviate from the truth. Jacob and Jerry Miller. Jerry just cracks me up. And at the same time, it shows you that how much word of mouth got around and how convincing it could be that Dane Coolidge, 35 years later, decides to take those notes, put them in a book called Arizona Cowboys. So if you want, look for it. It's usually not. It's not a higher end book. Arizona Cowboys by Dane Coolidge. I think it originally came out about 1938. When you read it, it does reference, when he was there, 1903, 1904, before he was married and he was traveling the Southwest. Pretty good read. Gives you a lot of good insight to the cowboys and the cowhands and the cattlemen in that area, Four Peaks and northern superstitions and all that. So there you go. Thank you very much for watching Chasing Legends and supporting us and those little vignettes of In This Day of the Superstition Mountains. Thank you for supporting us all the time. Otherwise, is on Fridays at Live Legends, where a lot of this stuff comes out. And I get a lot of feedback on future stories, which I got one the other day that I looked up and I found, and I thought, man, that'll make a cool future story from the state of Washington. And that individual's ears right now pricked up and said, oh, cool. So it's kind of nice to have the feedback, because the feedback sometimes gets me into those files to kind of look around and find something that might be a good story in the future and kind of fulfill the odd request. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for always being a subscriber if you are. If not, hit that subscribe button. And thank you for continuing to take the travel and the journey with us as we chase legends. But most importantly, always remember, I'm Wayne Tuttle. You're not. And this was Chasing Legends.